Hello and welcome to Lesson 4. So with Lesson 4 we make an important transition from the Romantic period to the Victorian period of British literature. This survey is divided into 3 parts. So we started with the Romantics, now we're going to study the Victorians for the next few lessons, and then our final few lessons will cover the 20th and 21st centuries. So we're going from the late 18th century / early 19th century up to the present. In the Victorian period, much like its writings, is this long, expansive period that spans really close to 80 years, where quite a lot of interesting writing was produced that engages with the various social issues of the day. This is actually the time period that I studied for my doctoral dissertation, so I'm very excited to begin this part of the class with you. And I think this image here really encapsulates this period very well. It's from the cover of Charles Dickens's novel Our Mutual Friend, which I would argue is the best novel of the Victorian period, and I would argue one of the greatest, most interesting, most complex novels in the English language. But this picture, which is a port in London along the River Thames, really encapsulates the industrialism of the age and how the sweeping changes of the industrialism of the age really affected the people living during that time. I chose to study the Victorian period because it was this period of immense sweeping change, and it really builds on many of the themes we saw beginning in the Romantic period and flushes those out more. And so for me, it really marks the transition to a modern world. With the Victorian period, we see a world that's still part of our past, but much closer, much similar um, to our present today than any of the previous time periods we study. And so we can really see some parallels with our own world and some important transitions. And it's just a fascinating period to study, and the way the literature engages with those issues is even more fascinating. So, with this first part of the lesson, we'll go over the background on the Victorian period, introduce you to the major historical events, as well as the themes and topics the writers chose to focus on. And then for the other 3 parts, we'll look at some of the main poets from the Victorian period: Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was the poet laureate, and then Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her husband Robert Browning. All right, so here's a few really key details that I think encapsulate the entire period. Um, by the mid-19th century, London had surpassed Paris as the pivotal center of Western civilization. So in the 18th century, Paris was seen as the center of Western civilization, but they really passed the torch to London in the 19th century. And so much of that had to do with Queen Victoria's rule and the achievements as well as the problems caused by those achievements of the British Empire at this time. And so we'll learn more about this as the lecture goes on. Britain became, during this time, the largest empire in the history of the world, surpassing even the Roman Empire. And that had all kinds of problems that came with it. Imperialism, colonialism are not good things. But it created this reputation of London as the center of the world, at least of the Western world. And there was so much scientific, industrial achievement that it earned this reputation. And those things came to characterize Queen Victoria's rule. Along with this, London's population expanded from 2 million to 6 million during that time, which is just huge. And here's the statement I think that really encapsulates the Victorian period well. The rapid growth of London represented the shift away from a way of life based on the ownership of land to a modern urban economy based on trade and manufacturing. Before the Victorian period, much of England was rural, and you really see the birth of urbanism, and really the birth of capitalism, at least as we know it today during the Victorian period. All right, so why call it the Victorian period, right? I think that would be one of the first questions I would ask if I were studying this time period for the first time. Romanticism, we studied where that name came from for that time period. And it really, I think, fits it well with the emphasis on spontaneity and emotion and imagination. So, why name this time period, this literary movement? Why name it after a person, a monarch? Um, we're not simply defaulting to naming each time period or literary movement after the monarch. We don't call Romanticism the Regency period when the Regent was ruling, but we call this the Victorian period. So let's explore why. She ruled from 1837 to 1901. So, as I said, 70 years, quite a long time. She's the first British monarch of whom we have pictures, and this is really important because we see her image and how it encapsulates this time period and what she stood for. So her name has become an adjective, just like we have Romanticism, we have Victorianism. There's not too many people you can say that about. And finally, here's why. So, in terms of themes for this time period, we really are going to talk about qualities. It's very much a time period. It was about ideals, about um, duty, what a person should strive to be. And Victoria herself, at least in her public image, exemplified those qualities: earnestness, moral responsibility, and domestic propriety. So it's really a time period of do your duty and hard work, of work ethic. So earnestness was very important. It was certainly a moral period. All kinds of laws and bills were passed um, to really try to curtail the instability introduced during the Romantic period. And so it was a time of a strong emphasis on morality. And then domestic propriety. This is a time period of separate spheres, um, where there was really an emphasis on women staying home, raising children, taking care of the home. And so these qualities are not necessarily good things. They can be very good things, but the way in which they were applied during the Victorian period was not always a good thing. So not only did the writers engage with these issues, they often critiqued and challenged them as well. But Victoria herself stood for these values, and those values came to and exemplified them. And so these values came to characterize the time period. And so her name became an adjective to describe this time period, or really anything that fits this mold. And so these are just three themes to help us identify the time period. But as we go on and study it more and study it over the course of the next four lessons, including this one, you'll really come to understand just what Victorianism is. And there's no one easy way to define it, but once you know it and recognize it, you'll know it when you see it, and you can say that's Victorianism. There's actually a really well done show on right now called Victoria. I can hear the theme song in my head right now that portrays her early life. It's really well done. So if you're interested in learning more about Queen Victoria, that'd be a good way to do that. Okay, it was such a long time period that it's usually broken up into shorter time periods for purposes of study. So we're right now going to look at three of those, or all three of those: the early, the middle, and the late. So in the 1830s and 40s, we had two major historical events, and they both had to do with industrialism. The Industrial Revolution really affected Victorian England. The first is the introduction of the railways, which began in 1844. So between 1844 and 1897, 6,000 miles and 21,000 lines of track were constructed. This is huge. This is really something that marks the transition to the modern world. A lot of the older, more agrarian ways of life went away and were replaced by urban capitalism. And so farming was still very important, but now farm products could reach London in hours rather than days. And this just revolutionized being able to travel throughout the country so quickly just changed people's lives really significantly. The second was parliamentary reform, primarily based on manufacturing interests. So again, the Industrial Revolution, and basically you had a majority of the population were factory owners, factory workers, or a good part of the population were factory owners. They wanted to be represented in Parliament, and so they pushed for reform. And you had at different points the vote extended to include not just landowners, but also factory owners. One example of this parliamentary reform is the repeal of the Corn Laws, which is a really significant event. The Napoleonic Wars in the 1890, or excuse me, in the 1790s and lasted through 1815. We talked about those during our study of Romanticism, caused blockades. So basically, nothing imported could reach England during the Napoleonic Wars because they were constantly fighting these naval battles with Napoleon. And so farmers could charge as much as they wanted for their products, especially grain. Nowadays, we can buy a loaf of bread, a cheap one, for $1. So we don't think of bread as being expensive, but it was one of the most basic foods, staple in many people's diet. And we couldn't, um, people couldn't get it. It was very expensive. And so people needed to be fed throughout the United Kingdom. And there was the Great Potato Famine in Ireland in the mid 19th century. And so they repealed the Corn Laws, which were put into place after the Napoleonic Wars to keep prices high. So in 1815, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. In 1815, the Corn Laws were put into place to keep the price of grain used to make bread high, to support the farmers. But so many people needed to eat with the potato famine in Ireland and whatnot that in 1846 these were repealed. And so it was a good thing in that it gave greater access to food to everyone throughout the UK. But on the other hand, it eventually, as we'll see as the lesson goes on, caused poverty and ruined many farmers in the countryside. So it was a paradoxical catch 22 thing. Feed the entire UK and impoverish, a significant population, or let that population flourish while the majority of the people can't eat. Almost unanswerable question. But a lot of the people who pushed for the repeal of the Corn Laws were factory owners who needed to feed their workers. So that's how it fits into this whole parliamentary reform thing. These are a few examples of how the Industrial Revolution really affected Victorian England. What are some of the things we saw during the mid Victorian period? One is Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, had the Crystal Palace belt, which was basically a great exhibition to show off achievements in modern industry and science. So again, industry was flourishing. You had all these new inventions and developments. Victorian Albert really wanted to show that off. And so the Crystal Palace, much like Victoria herself, really encapsulates the Victorian period. And it was constructed in 1851, right in the middle of this time period. But what were some of the other things that happened? Um, Two major events again, just like in the first period. One is unrestrained imperial expansion. So, as I mentioned earlier, you had just this rapid expansion where Britain just started colonizing place after place. And eventually, the empire would grow even bigger than the Roman Empire. It became the largest it ever was right before World War II, so a little bit later than this. But it really started growing and getting big during the Victorian period. It eventually collapsed because of World War II when Britain could no longer sustain all of its colonies. It just got too big to continue to exist. But the time period with the most rapid expansion was the Victorian period. And in India figured as kind of the prime example representative of empire. The colonization of India, we'll learn as we go on, really came to represent what um, Britain believed it was doing. And so much so that Queen Victoria eventually called herself Empress of India. There was an initial mutiny in 1857, which was an important event. And after that, Britain intervened even more thoroughly in their control of India, and that's when she came to be called this. Um, the idea of progress. Basically, Britain saw itself as as we saw earlier, as the center of the universe. And so they thought they needed to bring their values to the rest of the world. And so that was how they justified colonization. But in reality, it was very much a material thing. And like we saw during the Romantic period, those colonial goods were coveted. And so that was in many ways the real impetus behind it. But it used this idea of progress, which was a big idea throughout the entire Victorian period. Everyone, the lower class, the people in the colonies, they all needed to progress as industrialism was moving things forward and people's values were shifting with that. Um, the other major event was the religious crisis. Many people had a crisis in faith and fell away from their Christianity, their religious views. There are a lot of reasons for this, and it built up for a long time. We'll really talk about it in detail in the next part of the lecture when we discuss Tennyson, because he was really affected by it. But Darwin's theory of natural selection played a big role in this because it reduced humankind's sense of its own importance. It made us seem more like the animals. And then the age of the earth is another factor, as well as just the idea of natural selection with its competitiveness really clashed with Victorian um, genteel values. All right, so the late period, the last 30 years or so, what are some things that happened here? You had the apex of British imperialism, so the imperial expansion began in the mid period, but um, really gained steam during the last 30 years. You had the Great Depression, which many call the Long Depression, to not be confused with the Great Depression in the U.S. And this was the poverty in the rural farming communities in the countryside, in part caused by the Corn Laws, the repeal of the Corn Laws, the allowing of imported grain, so farmers could not keep prices high. And really, as Americans expanded out west and opened up more territory, they provided a lot of the grain and other farming products that competed with the British farmers. And so you had a Great Depression, rural poverty among the farming community. The 90s really marked the shift away from the Victorian values and kind of the transition to the next century, the next time period. Prince Albert, like Queen Victoria, represented those values we talked about earlier. Um, Work ethic, morality, domesticity, whereas Edward, their oldest son, who would become ruler after Victoria died in 1901, and the Edwardian period would begin in 1901, he was much more carefree and did not have quite the same values. And so the 1890s, Edward was already 50 years old and would be 60 when he became ruler. So Victoria and Albert were very old. And so the 90s were really a decade of decadence. And, and Edward represented that the way his parents represented Victorian values. Also, something that was widely debated throughout the entire Victorian period, but really especially toward the end, was what we call the woman question. And basically, this was a general discussion about women's roles in society. As I said, the Victorian period is a period that really emphasized the separate spheres and was very patriarchal and very, very oppressive to women. You know, really all time periods throughout human history have been. It's tragic, but it was emphasized more during the Victorian period. As we'll talk about in the next slide, the Victorian period was this time where people just wrote and wrote and wrote. New inventions in printing, as well as education of of the working and lower classes, enabled more and more people to write. So public discourse really became a thing, and people just openly talked about what should the role of women be, which had never really been done before. So I think that's why the patriarchal, hypocritical, double standards of the Victorian period are, with regard to women's roles, are it's even more of a question here than earlier time periods because people were discussing it overtly. It's a better way of saying what I'm trying to say. But this debate was mainly, among the middle class. Um, Working class and lower class women had even fewer rights. And there was also this concept of a governess, a woman who would educate the children for a rich family. And so the governess occupied an interesting role between classes. And you actually saw novels written about this, governess novels, with Jane Eyre being a prime example. Uh, One of the great tragedies of this period was that many lower and working class women were driven into prostitution due to economic circumstances. And in the rise of prostitution during the Victorian period became an obsessive public concern. People considered it an epidemic, and there were all kinds of articles published about it. It became an obsession. As I mentioned, the separate spheres, the idea that women should remain in the domestic sphere because they need to be pure and innocent, and the public sphere would taint them. That was really emphasized, so it was very limiting to women, but there are still really interesting examples of women finding ways to operate within that domestic sphere and critique the patriarchal standards that are interesting. And finally, the last bullet point I'll introduce here is that in the 1890s, the idea of the new woman emerged, um, which is emancipated womanhood. Basically, women who didn't adhere to these earlier values I've been mentioning and lived a more independent, autonomous lifestyle. And so you also, again, had novels representing this, Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure being a prime example. And so, again, we'll discuss the woman question just like empire in much more detail in subsequent lessons, but here's a very brief overview. Okay, just a couple more slides and we'll wrap up our background here. So, as I mentioned before, literacy really increased, and the Victorians just wrote and wrote. They wrote novels, poems, plays, articles, letters, diaries, so on and so forth. And so, for the first time, you had a mass reading and a mass writing audience. And so, literacy and publication were very important. Literacy increased significantly during the period. This was in part due to technological advances, printing presses powered by steam, paper made from wood pulp rather than rags, and typesetting machines. So much of what we see with modern production of paper today took place during the Victorian period. So you had more people reading and more things to read. The literacy meant, with the middle, working, and lower classes becoming educated, the literacy meant more people were reading, and these technological advances meant they had more things to read. But books were expensive, and so people would borrow them from libraries. But libraries weren't what we see today, where we can get books for free. They were called lending libraries, and they were commercial. You had to pay to borrow books. And so this rise in reading and rise in publication really led to a commodification, a commercialization of reading, where it became an industry with profit to be made. And we also see the rise of capitalism here. So those are all things are all intertangled. And these lending libraries really took advantage of people. They would do novels in 3 volumes. And so you'd check out one volume, return it, a new volume would come out, you'd have to wait. Um, so that build up, that waiting would lead to people really wanting the next volume, and there was profit to be made. Serial publication was also huge. So people would read journals. For the first time, you had journals, a wide variety of journals and newspapers being published. And so people would read those. And so you'd have novels serialized, where you'd have a novel broken up, say, into 20 parts. And, each week or each month, depending on when the journal was published, you could read the next part of the story. And so it was very much, if you read Victorian novels, you'll see it was very much a time where there was some suspense, a lot of cliffhangers kind of building up to the next part to keep people hooked. But this was interesting because it enabled authors to make changes as they went based on the response of the reading public. But you also have the longest novels of any period of English literary history because of the serialization of these 3 volumes. It was a profit thing, and some books were actually longer. Some writers like Dickens and George Eliot, who we'll study in the next lesson, um, they really have these interesting, long, complex narratives. But other people were just writing for the length of it and because there was profit to be made. And so poetry was important, but this is where we really see the rise of the novel. Up to this point, poetry had been the dominant literary genre. That was what the upper class liked to read. But in this period, with the mass literacy, the working class, the lower class, the middle class, they wanted to read novels. And so this is the rise of the novel. This is where we see the transition from, like, before you just had a few people like Austen and Scott and Edgeworth writing novels. Now everybody's writing novels. There's a plethora of novels. If you look up the statistics on how many novels were written before the Victorian period and then during it, it's, thousands upon thousands percent difference. And so this is really the period of the rise of the novel. With this kind of serial publication and novels being published in 3 volumes, it no longer, and then mass literacy, the reading public expanded. It was no longer the stable idea. And so writers had to find new ways to engage with their reading public, which we'll talk about more, especially when we talk about Dickens in the next lecture, because he was, after Byron, really like the first celebrity and really had a relationship with his reading public. Last slide here, we'll just real quickly talk a little bit more about the genres. The rise of the novel, which I already mentioned. I should mention realism. So we talked about Victorianism as an adjective, but just like Romanticism took place in different parts of the world, and you had Transcendentalism in the U.S., which was really like American Romanticism, the themes and the values of the Victorian period, the emphasis on morality and domesticity and earnestness, that wasn't unique just to England. So what did they call it in other parts of the world where Victoria wasn't ruling? In America, as well as other places, the best term would be realism, because writers strived to capture today these melodramatic, sentimental novels of the Victorian period don't seem very realistic to us. But compared to the Romantics, the authors of the Victorian period wanted to portray daily life and represent events as realistically as possible. So we'll talk about that transition. Remember, literary movement is often a reaction against the previous one. So a reaction to the spontaneity and imagination and emotion of the Romantics was this emphasis on depicting life as it is in the Victorian period. So even though we saw the rise of the novel, and it's considered the dominant form from the Victorian period, just as poetry was considered the dominant form in the Romantic period, poetry was still important, and we'll still read a lot of poets, including the ones in this lecture. And he saw some interesting experimentation in form. Robert Browning's dramatic monologues would also be an example of that. There was a focus on psychology in Victorian poetry that anticipates the modern period. And what you see is a lot of long narrative poetry, whereas the Romantics wrote these short lyric poems. Many of the Victorian poems read like stories and novels. They're much more narrative driven. It was a very narrative driven time period. So if you really like narrative, you'll find this period interesting. And it was also a period of a lot of prose publication. Writers like Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater, Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, some of whom we'll read, but not all of them, published important essays that are still influential today. And finally, even though it was the rise of the novel, just like these other things that we mentioned, drama was also important. So Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest and other examples show how plays were still really important. So here's a good overview of the Victorian period. I can't wait to dive into it more with you, and I hope you find it as interesting and intriguing as I do.